years ago, much like today, a lot of the headlines were about politics. Voters were about to elect a governor in Illinois, a Chicago mayor. But shocking word about a popular painkiller knocked campaign news out of the headlines. The Tylenol murders. Someone poisoned capsules and killed 7 people randomly in Chicago and its suburbs. CBS 2 investigator Dorothy Tucker digs into the CBS 2 vault to show you how one of the country's most infamous unsolved cases began and how reporters covered it before the days of internet and social media.
WBBM Television, Chicago.
Nearly 11 million people are out of work, and I share their suffering and frustration.
I like being your governor, and I want to be your governor with you.
I live for no other purpose than to serve Illinois and to serve the Democratic Party.
September 29th, 1982. Local, state, and national politicians dominate Chicago news.
Back in 1982, I was the Illinois Attorney General.
On the evening of the 29th, Ty Fainer was also campaigning.
I was out at Pheasant Run.
At a fundraiser when he got the shocking news that would shift his focus from politics to poisonings.
By probably about 8, 9 o'clock at night.
2 suburban communities. 3 members of one family and a 12-year-old girl from another were dead or near death.
The biggest thing that we need to do.
And I said, well, get the team together. The Illinois State Police, Sheriff's Association, local law enforcement, and had, I think, probably 20, 25 people get together in a meeting the very next morning.
That next morning, on September 30th, Ed Marshall was working.
I was here on the assignment desk.
His job compiling a list of the day's news stories.
There was some sort of bulletin from one of the authorities that there was going to be a press conference about a series of poisoning deaths.
That got his attention.
That was an instant trigger to tell us that something big was going on.
It was huge. The medical examiner's office delivered the deadly details.
We have definitely confirmed the presence of cyanide in 2 containers of extra-strength Tylenol.
Who did it? How? Why?
The tips started coming into the Attorney General's office.
But on that day, the first call was to the makers of Tylenol.
We called them, and they pulled everything off the shelves. They called the Walgreens, all the stores where their product was distributed. They got it off the shelves.
When Fainer finally faced the press.
And then we're going to turn to finding that madman or the madmen who are responsible for this very, very sick behavior.
And in the newsroom.
Well, in the newsroom then, everything stopped, and all we did was focus on this one story.
And back then, there was no Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, Instagram.
We didn't have the benefit of the internet then.
Jackie, can you hear me?
And all we had were old-fashioned phones. The assignment desk had half a dozen phones. It was like being in a boiler room. The phones were constantly ringing. You had reporters calling in, you had photographers calling in, you had law enforcement calling in.
Everyone had one goal: warn the public.
Cyanide-contaminated Tylenol has been responsible for 3 deaths. Do not take Tylenol until further notice.
This product may be contaminated with cyanide and should be destroyed.
I remember they're going to CHA buildings.
Tinta Strasberg covered the murders for the Chicago Defender.
People were afraid in the community.
We're here to see if you have any Tylenol capsules. You don't have any? No Tylenol at all?
They were calling the Defender, asking what should we do, and it was just terrible.
Destroy the medicine. Do not leave it around the home.
It got worse. The following day, October 1st, new reports.
The circle of cyanide poisonings now makes a 40-mile arc around the city of Chicago, touching 7 west suburban communities.
It appears she had collapsed into her closet.
Police discovered the 7th body.
I recall that the police had called me.
Channel 2's John Drummond was one of the lead reporters on the Tylenol murders.
He said, we've located a woman who was a Tylenol victim with cyanide.
This death was in Chicago, Old Town.
He said, she's in the apartment right now. I was at the station. I went over immediately with the crew.
It was a United flight attendant.
This affected literally everybody. People were scared.
Paralyzed by fear.
Where'd you get these things at?
People in the Chicago area continue to bring bottles of the Tylenol into local police stations.
I think what bothers me more than just this incident is if it can happen with this, what else can it happen? That's the part that really gives you the creeps.
Today, Tylenol bottles filled with capsules, tablets, and liquid were coming in by the thousands to the basement of the Daly Center, where Department of Health workers were logging and sorting them for testing.
Somebody's crazy. Has to be.
The public desperately wanted answers, but 5 days into the tragedy, frustrated investigators had few.
When someone gets killed, usually there's an intent to kill that person or someone like that person. Here, it was totally random. Put the deadly poison in commerce and see who drops as a result. And that was frightening. It was very, very frightening.
Dorothy Tucker, CBS 2 Investigators.
CBS 2 investigator Dorothy Tucker. Dorothy, remarkable work. It is hard to imagine how life turned on a dime that day. I mean, one day it's all politics. Interest rates are high. It's the fall, 1982. The Bears have hired some guy named Ditka to coach the team.
Michael Jordan's not here yet.
Michael Jordan is just a dream in the future. Yeah, exactly. And fascinating to hear from Ty Fainer. He was a guy who was locked in an election, trying to become Attorney General in the state of Illinois in his own right. November was right around the corner, and everything changed in one moment in time.
Tylenol Ty.
Mm-hmm.
That's what he said people called him.
Wow.
because it was all consuming. He was on television every day, and as you saw in our piece, there was story after story where there was much more than that as well. The news conferences, we took you back to, it was in Des Plaines. They had it was an old police station, and that's where all the pictures that you saw of not just 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 cameras, there were 15, 20 cameras, and some reporters from across the country, across, other parts of the world, who would come to cover this story. It was huge, as you saw. It was a huge story.
You get a sense, it's not ever said outright, but you get a sense from former Attorney General Ty Fainer in your piece that there isn't regret. They're never going to put that word on it.
Right.
And I've talked to a lot of investigators, but there are so many what ifs. And, the Monday evening quarterbacking, how they handled it. You get that sense too?
Oh my goodness, the one thing that the takeaway that I had from him was the frustration of, they would get the tips, they'd follow up on the tips, and they'd go nowhere. They would take a phone call, they would make a phone call, and it was the frustration of just trying to figure out not just the how and the where, but the why. If you remember at the end of the piece, he said, you had somebody who just kind of threw these pills out there. And for what? Typically you can figure out there's a motive, there's a target, there's an aim for murder, but this was so random, and he talks about that. That's what he talked about, and that's what made it so terrifying, that it was so random. Mm-hmm. And the fear was, and he said this too, is this it? Will this happen again? Could this happen again? 40 years later, it's never happened again. But then but we also don't know yet, who did it.
Yeah, we don't know. Yeah. Everything changed though. Everything changed in our medicine cabinets today because of that event. That's why we have those cumbersome
tamper-proof.
Tamper-proof. We've got the seal, you've got the cotton, you've got everything because of the 7 who died in Chicago and greater Chicago. And you also hit on, and I think it's very interesting, you know, at first it was a crime in the burbs. So you talk about, and it's a really interesting angle, how it was covered and how the coverage changed in the black and brown communities. Take me into that. How that was interesting to you. That was a discovery moment, wasn't it?
You know, because, all right, so in 1982, I was not in Chicago, but I was in Pittsburgh, you know, covering the story from what, you know, what if, could it happen here and that sort of thing. I remember covering that story myself.
Wow.
But I called home and said to Mom and Dad, Tylenol in the cabinet, get up, you know, you see what's happening, you know, take it off the shelf, don't do this, don't do that. That was something that was going on in every community, you know, in the black community included. You know, black people were very concerned about this. But when I spoke to Chinta Strasburg, who was the lead reporter for the Chicago Defender, you know, when we go back in the archives and we look at the newspaper, Tylenol is not plastered across the top of it like it was on the Sun-Times, like it was on the Tribune. It's this little article in the corner. And, you know, I said to her, why? And it was because at that time, Harold Washington is running, and there's a lot of talk about, is he going to get in the race? When is he going to get in the race? And she covered primarily politics. So that first day, it was not. She said, but it became a much bigger story because of the concern, the fear, and especially when at first it was kind of just a story that was kind of happening in the northwest suburbs. You know, it was Arlington Heights, it was Elmhurst, there was stuff going on there. And then you had the death, the discovery of the United flight attendant in Chicago.
Paula Prince.
Yeah, Paula Prince. And, you know, she said, and then the phone calls started coming in. And the black community just wanted to know, what are we supposed to do? You know, what's going on? You know, are they targeting the black community? And the city, you know, what we also found, and you saw in the piece, the police were out, they were at the housing projects. You know, they went door to door, knocking on every door in the CHA in the high rises. You know, they had the bullhorns telling people, you know, do you have any? If you have any, you know, put it in the garbage, throw it away, give it to the police or something. They were driving around in the radios and the bullhorns. You know, so this was something that was of a concern to everybody. And, you know, that was just of interest to me, that, you know, it wasn't on the front page, but doggone it, folks were scared.
Yeah. Something so remarkable about this story is in that early going that you transported us to, authorities really didn't know what they had because it had never happened before, never happened since. And there was almost, you talk to people who lived through it, it was truly surreal. Like, could there be a killer in my medicine cabinet? Right. That extra strength Tylenol capsule? And then it started to become real, and you've touched on this, started to become real when you started to see the faces. And John Drummond, who you referenced, the lion of a reporter here at CBS 2, the bulldog, said it really hit people when you could see the body of the flight attendant Paula Prince being hauled out on a gurney. It almost seemed like it was a scene out of Vietnam or something, a body in a gurney. Like that really hit.
It hit, and here's why. Prior to that, for the first couple of days, you know, what you saw on television, you look back at the reports, the houses of where the victims had lived. You saw the school of where Mary had gone to school. You know, you were talking to people after the fact. But when Drummond got that phone call that said, hey, there's a body, we think it's connected, and it looks like she took the cyanide and she died in her apartment, and he grabbed the camera, and he had the cameraman rush over then, and they had that picture. I mean, you know, before that, it was houses. That body being taken from that apartment, being put into the ambulance like that, that smacked you right in the face. that image was something that you could tell that Drummond said that was almost the defining moment to make everybody say, whoa, wait a minute. You know, we're talking, we aren't just seeing a photograph. We see the body of somebody who died from taking Tylenol. And remember, her body had been there for a couple of days. Her family and friends did not know what had happened to her. They just couldn't get in touch with her. And then this happens, you know, and then so that made people say, I'm sure, well, is there somebody else out there that we don't know about it? You know, and the panic then, I think, really just kind of consumed the public more than it had really before. You know, Drummond talked about being personally, you know, concerned about his family members, and you know, the people that we spoke to in the newsroom. You know, they were all concerned about everybody then, because it, again, that one smacked you in the face. That one hit home.
Those you talk to, is there hope 40 years later that this thing can be solved?
You know, everyone I spoke with, and I'm sure you too, there is such a frustration that it was never solved. And, you know, you hear people say, they almost hope that the killer is still alive, just so they can get some answers, you know? Because it's just the unknown. It's not knowing. It's not being able to really ask the question and get an answer of why. You know, why would you do this? How exactly did you do this? But more importantly, what was the motivation? What were you after? You know, and everybody just had that fear of 40 years ago it happened. You know, in the little part of them seemed to say, if he or she's still alive, would they do it again? Could it happen again? You want that peace of mind that says, you know who it is, and it's over. And we don't, as a community, as a society, we don't have that yet. No. We don't really have it.
Right, it's not over.
No, it's not over.
And we talk to so many people that are continuing living it to this day.
Oh, yeah.
Dorothy Tucker, CBS 2 Investigator, remarkable story. Thank you for that report, and continue to stay with us here on the stream as we mark 40 years since the Tylenol murders and our upcoming docuseries, Painkiller, the Tylenol murders, 40 years unsolved. I'm Brad Edwards. Thank you for joining us on the stream. Now back to the stream.
It was probably one of the first acts of domestic terrorism.
A frightening pattern began to take shape some 5 hours later in the neighboring suburb of Arlington Heights.
When you live through something like that, you'll never forget it.
This was a terrible tragedy for 7 families.
He took my life, shattered my life and my family life.
Calls have been coming into the investigative task force so heavily that all 7 lines into the center have been almost constantly jammed.
If it can happen with this, what else can it happen?
Have you found a common denominator?
No, sir. We're working in conjunction with Johnson & Johnson in an effort to determine if there is a common denominator.
Who would think of that? What kind of mind thinks about that?
The search for the Tylenol cyanide killer continues to center on this photograph.
Have you ever done an interview about this?
No, only with the FBI.
7 people? You're gonna let a murderer just go?
Why can't the authorities arrest this man? He's a madman.
Kansas City Police Sergeant David Barton was watching an evening news broadcast when he saw a picture of a man who looked familiar.
I jumped off the couch, said, "That's damn James Lewis."
You remember the name Lewis?
I just told you that 3 times.
Just another one of the ups that plagued this case.
We're actively pursuing this investigation. This is not collecting dust on a shelf.
I don't think it'll ever be solved. For 40 years, you would think that somebody would say something.
Have you ever seen this guy? Hi, Mr. Lewis?
If this was on the shelves then, we wouldn't be sitting here now.